When Tasha K mentioned Teyana Taylor this time, it didn't land like casual commentary. It landed like a match thrown into dry gasoline. Within minutes, clips were circulating, captions were escalating, and the internet did what it always does best: jumped straight to conclusions before context could catch up. The reaction wasn't curiosity, it was alarm. Tasha didn't present documents, she didn't release proof. She spoke in that familiar tone that has made her one of the most controversial voices online: confident, confrontational, and deliberately provocative. That tone alone was enough to make people stop scrolling. Because when Tasha K says she knows something, audiences don't wait to verify. They react first and ask questions later. What made this moment especially volatile wasn't just who spoke, it was who was named. Teyana Taylor has built a public image around control, intention, and privacy. She rarely responds to online mess. She doesn't explain herself to rumor culture. That restraint has protected her brand for years, but it also made this moment dangerous. Silence creates space, and the internet rushes to fill it with speculation. As clips spread, language escalated fast. Claims turned into secrets, mentioned turned into exposed. People who never watched the full segment reacted to headlines alone. Comment sections exploded with certainty, even though nothing had been verified. That's how modern scandals form, not through confirmation but through repetition. Fans split immediately. Some argued Tasha was crossing a line she's crossed too many times before. Others insisted that uncomfortable conversations are necessary, even when they involve big names. Very few paused to ask what was actually said versus what was being implied. Once fear enters the conversation, nuance disappears. What followed wasn't just backlash. It was a firestorm of reaction videos, think pieces, and social posts debating whether Tasha should be believed or stopped. And in the middle of all of it stood Teyana Taylor, silent, unmoving, and unwilling to engage. This isn't just a story about allegations. It's about how fast the internet turns suggestion into certainty, and how dangerous that becomes when real names are involved. Because once a narrative like this starts, it doesn't wait for truth. It feeds on attention. And the real question isn't what was said, it's what happens when millions decide what they think it means. To understand why this moment exploded so quickly, you have to understand who Tasha K is in the media ecosystem. Tasha isn't treated like a traditional journalist, but she isn't dismissed as pure entertainment either. She operates in the grey area between commentary and allegation, where tone often matters more than proof. That grey area is exactly where virality lives. Over the years, Tasha has built her platform by positioning herself as someone who says what others won't. Her supporters argue that she challenges powerful figures and refuses to play industry politics. Her critics argue that she blurs ethical lines, prioritizing shock over responsibility. Both sides, however, agree on one thing: when Tasha K names someone, attention follows immediately. That's because her delivery creates urgency. She doesn't sound unsure, she doesn't hedge carefully. She speaks with confidence even when discussing unverified information. In online culture, confidence is often mistaken for credibility. Viewers don't pause to ask whether something has been confirmed. They react to how certain it sounds. That reaction fuels the algorithm, and the algorithm does the rest. This dynamic becomes especially volatile when the name involved is Teyana Taylor. Teyana represents discipline and control in an environment that thrives on chaos. She rarely addresses rumors. She doesn't feed speculation. She chooses silence strategically. That restraint has protected her image, but it also creates a vacuum when her name is pulled into controversy. Silence doesn't slow internet narratives, it accelerates them. When Tasha referenced Teyana, she didn't need to be explicit. The mention alone was enough to trigger speculation. Fans immediately assumed there must be something serious behind it, because Tasha's history has trained audiences to expect scandal. Even people who distrust her content felt compelled to watch, just in case something real was unfolding. Another reason this moment escalated is Tasha's past legal and public battles. She is widely known for having faced consequences over unverified claims before. That history adds tension to every new statement she makes. Viewers know the stakes are high. Some watch hoping she's finally crossed a line again. Others watch believing she wouldn't risk her platform unless she believed what she was saying. Either way, the controversy becomes the attraction. What's important is what wasn't presented. No documents, no medical confirmation. No direct accusation framed as fact. Yet the internet quickly filled in those gaps. This is the danger of implication culture. When someone with a reputation for controversy hints at something serious, audiences rush to complete the story themselves. The completed version is often far more extreme than anything originally said. Language played a huge role. Clips were reposted with captions that escalated meaning. Words like secret, exposed, and this is bad appeared immediately, even when they didn't accurately reflect the source material. Most viewers never heard the original wording. They reacted to the framing. Framing, not facts, shaped the narrative. Teyana's silence became its own storyline. Supporters called it dignity and refusal to engage with mess. Critics called it suspicious. Neither interpretation was confirmed, but both spread rapidly. In outrage culture, silence is rarely respected. It's treated as an invitation to speculate. This situation also exposed how uneven power can feel online. Tasha speaks loudly and often. Teyana says nothing. Yet the louder voice dominates the conversation regardless of accuracy. That imbalance allows narratives to harden without resistance. Once a story hardens, even correction struggles to break through. Another factor driving virality is audience psychology. People are drawn to stories that suggest hidden danger or suppressed truth. The idea that something important is being kept quiet triggers fear and curiosity at the same time. That emotional mix lowers skepticism. People share first and question later. By the end of this phase, the story wasn't about what Tasha K actually said. It was about what people believed she meant. Belief took over where verification never arrived. And once belief sets in, it doesn't require new information to survive. It feeds on repetition. This is how reputations get pulled into chaos without consent. Not through confirmed reporting, but through suggestion amplified by algorithms and rewarded by attention. Tasha K didn't need to prove anything to spark outrage. She only needed to speak in a space already primed for fear and distrust. And once that spark hits, the internet rarely stops to ask who gets burned. By the time this controversy reached most timelines, very few people were reacting to what Tasha K actually said. They were reacting to what the internet decided she meant. That distinction is crucial because the escalation didn't come from new information. It came from interpretation layered on top of implication, amplified at algorithm speed. In the original segment, Tasha spoke in broad, suggestive language. She framed her comments as allegations and hinted that there were conversations happening behind the scenes that the public wasn't aware of. She did not present documentation. She did not confirm details. She relied on tone certainty without specificity. In long-form content that leaves room for debate, in the clip economy, it leaves room for distortion. The first shift happened in editing. Longer sections that included qualifiers, pauses, or rhetorical framing were cut down to seconds. The most provocative phrases were isolated and looped. Once separated from context, those phrases felt definitive. Ambiguity doesn't survive short clips. It gets sharpened into certainty because certainty performs better. Then came the captions. Words like alleges, claims, and mentions were quickly replaced by stronger language in reposts. Each iteration nudged the story further away from caution and closer to panic. Viewers scrolling past didn't hear nuance. They absorbed headlines. Headlines told them something urgent and dangerous was being revealed, and urgency overrides skepticism. This is where Teyana Taylor became trapped in a narrative she didn't choose. She did not respond publicly. She did not acknowledge the chatter. But silence online doesn't freeze a story, it accelerates it. Without her voice present, others filled the space with assumptions, assigning motives and emotions she never confirmed. Reaction culture poured fuel on the fire. Commentary channels framed the moment as an expose, promising clarity while delivering speculation. Thumbnails used alarming language, titles implied certainty. Many viewers reacted to reactions rather than the source material. By the time the story peaked, a large portion of the audience had never seen the original context at all. Another subtle shift occurred when possibility quietly became probability. Comment sections stopped asking whether the allegation was accurate and started debating why such things would be hidden. That pivot matters. Once concealment becomes the premise, every lack of confirmation is reframed as proof of a cover-up. Silence becomes strategy. Distance becomes intent. There's no neutral position left. Audience psychology played a decisive role. Stories that suggest hidden danger trigger fear and curiosity simultaneously. That emotional combination lowers critical thinking. People share first and verify later, if at all. When a narrative aligns with existing distrust of gossip media and celebrity culture, It feels believable even without evidence. Language continued to escalate because escalation is rewarded. Disgust doesn't trend. This is bad does. Each repost raised the temperature, not the accuracy. And once the temperature rises, attempts to slow the story feel like denial or suppression to those already invested. What's often missed is how responsibility diffuses across the system. The speaker can say she made allegations, not statements of fact. Creators can say they were reacting. Platforms can say they don't editorialize. Viewers can say they were just sharing. No single actor feels accountable, yet reputational impact accumulates anyway. This phase also exposed a double standard. Loud implication is often rewarded as courage, while restraint is punished as avoidance. Tasha's certainty dominated the conversation. Teyana's silence was overinterpreted. Neither approach guaranteed fairness, but the louder one controlled the narrative. By the end of this stage, the story no longer depended on what was said. It depended on belief. Belief is resilient. It doesn't need new information to survive. It feeds on repetition. And repetition had already done its work. The question now wasn't whether the allegation was verified. It was whether the internet felt justified in treating it as settled. That's the moment when a rumor becomes a memory, and memories are hard to correct. The next phase is where consequences begin to linger. Backlash, fan wars, credibility battles, and the moment the internet stops observing and starts judging. Once the story reached critical mass, it stopped being about what Tasha K implied and became about what people believed. That shift changed everything. The internet no longer wanted clarification, it wanted a verdict. And once a verdict starts forming at scale, facts become optional. Two sides emerged almost instantly. Supporters of Tasha framed the backlash as proof she had touched a nerve. In their view, criticism wasn't about ethics, it was about silencing uncomfortable conversations. They argued that if nothing serious existed behind the scenes, there wouldn't be such intense pushback. Every call for caution was reframed as protection of celebrity image. On the other side, defenders of Teyana Taylor pushed back hard. They argued that vague implication tied to a real person's name, especially around sensitive topics, was irresponsible. For them, this wasn't about free speech. It was about harm amplified by algorithms and monetized by reaction culture. They questioned why unverified claims should be treated as public debate at all. What made the divide explode was moral framing. This stopped being about content and became about character. One side accused the other of protecting power. The other accused their critics of chasing clout. Once morality enters the debate, compromise disappears. People don't defend arguments anymore, they defend identity. As the fight escalated, history was weaponized. Old clips of Tasha resurfaced to argue she was either a truth-teller or a repeat offender. Past interviews and career moments involving Teyana were dissected for signs that had never been framed as suspicious before. Even neutral moments were reread as clues. The past was rewritten to justify conclusions already reached. Silence from Teyana became the most overinterpreted element of all. Supporters called it dignity and restraint. Critics framed it as avoidance. Neither interpretation was confirmed, but both traveled equally far. In outrage culture, silence doesn't slow a narrative, it becomes a canvas for projection. Reaction channels fueled the chaos. Each new video escalated language and certainty. Thumbnails grew more alarming, titles grew more definitive. Alleged quietly disappeared. The story became a content engine and outrage became the fuel. Viewers were encouraged to pick a side and stay there. This is the moment the internet became judge and jury. Comment sections read like verdicts. People spoke with absolute certainty about events they could not verify. Careers and reputations were debated as if they were fictional plotlines rather than real lives. The line between commentary and harm blurred completely. What's most unsettling is how accountability evaporated. The speaker could say she made allegations, not statements of fact. Creators could say they were just reacting. Platforms could say they're neutral. Audiences could say they were just sharing. Responsibility dissolved across the system, but consequences remained concentrated on the person being discussed. Speed played a major role. There was no pause for verification because verification doesn't trend. Attempts to slow the conversation were dismissed as damage control. Once a narrative reaches this velocity, correction feels like censorship to those already invested. By now, the original implication barely mattered. The story had evolved into a referendum on credibility, power, and who deserves belief. Facts were secondary, feelings were primary, and feelings don't require evidence to feel justified. This is the point where reputational damage becomes hardest to reverse. The internet may move on quickly, but associations linger. Search results remember what trends forget. And once a story settles into public memory, it rarely gets updated with nuance. The next and final phase isn't louder, it's quieter and more permanent. It's about aftermath. About what remains once the noise fades and the damage settles. When the trending tabs refreshed and the clips slowed down, nothing felt resolved. There were no confirmations, no corrections that traveled as far as the original headlines. The internet simply moved on, the way it always does, leaving behind something far more permanent than a trend: association. This is the phase most people don't stay for because it isn't exciting, it's uncomfortable. For Tasha K, the aftermath followed a familiar pattern. Her name stayed in rotation. Supporters praised her for speaking her mind. Critics accused her of recklessness, but attention continued to reward her platform. In outrage culture, controversy is currency and clarity is optional. Once the moment passed, there was no obligation to clarify or clean up the narrative she helped ignite. Implication has a built-in escape hatch. When challenged, it can retreat into ambiguity. "I never said that, people twisted my words." Technically, that defense works. The harm, however, doesn't disappear just because intent can be debated. Impact exists independently of explanation. For Teyana Taylor, the cost was quieter but far heavier. She never entered the conversation, yet her name became inseparable from it. That's the hidden tax of modern fame. You don't have to respond to be implicated. Silence does not protect you once your name becomes content. It simply removes your voice while others speak for you. Her restraint was interpreted every possible way except the simplest one. Privacy, some saw strength, others saw avoidance. Neither interpretation was confirmed, but repetition made them feel established. That's how reputational residue forms, not through proof but through echo. Once an association exists, it lingers in comment sections, search results, and memory. What this story truly exposes isn't hidden secrets or behind-the-scenes truth. It exposes how modern narratives are built. Suggestion becomes story, story becomes belief, belief becomes memory, and memory rarely checks sources. Once something is framed as dangerous or hidden, every lack of clarity feels suspicious. Silence becomes strategy. Distance becomes intent. The most uncomfortable truth is how easily audiences justify participation. People said they were just reacting, just sharing clips, just asking questions. But collective behavior creates collective harm. When thousands repeat an implication, it functions like a verdict, even if no one intended it to. This is the incentive problem at the heart of viral culture. Outrage is rewarded. Certainty spreads faster than caution. And the people who speak the loudest are rarely held to the same standard as those being spoken about. The system encourages escalation without consequence, then moves on before responsibility can catch up. It also forces a hard question about what we actually want. Do we want truth, or do we want stories that feel true? Because those are not the same thing. Truth requires patience, verification, and discomfort with not knowing. Viral stories require confidence, speed, and emotional payoff. Most of the time, the internet chooses the second. Nothing in this moment was proven. Nothing was resolved. Yet something permanent was created: perception. And perception shapes how people are discussed long after the trend dies. That's the real power of implication. It doesn't need confirmation to endure. So here's the final question worth sitting with. When does calling something an allegation become a license to speculate without restraint? When does chasing engagement excuse the absence of evidence? And how many reputations have to absorb damage before we admit the system itself is broken? Because the internet doesn't remember corrections the way it remembers controversy. It doesn't reward silence the way it rewards outrage. And once a narrative like this takes hold, the truth isn't what matters most anymore. What matters is what people believed. And belief, once shared widely enough, becomes its own kind of reality.